The house felt suffocating. Every room she entered seemed smaller, more cramped, as though the walls were slowly closing in on her. The air, once filled with the comforting sounds of family laughter, conversation, the clatter of dishes had now turned heavy, thick with suspicion, and whispers that fell silent the moment she walked in. It was as though the very atmosphere had changed, charged with something unspoken yet tangible. She had been through countless family gatherings in this house, but this time was different. Everything felt different since that morning. The confrontation at breakfast had been swift, sudden like a thunderstorm that rolls in without warning, shaking the earth with its intensity. She could still feel the tremor of it under her skin, lingering in the pit of her stomach. It had left her raw, exposed, like an open wound that no amount of time or space could heal. Her mother's eyes had been filled with a mix of confusion and hurt, the question in them both a demand and a plea. What is going on between you two? She'd stood there, frozen, unable to answer, unable to even meet her mother's gaze. The truth had been right there, hanging in the air, but she couldn't give it voice. And her cousin? He had sat silently, his head down, his shoulders tense, as though the weight of it all was bearing down on him too. Since then, every moment in the house had become unbearable. The tension stretched between them like a thin, fraying rope. It was clear to her that the rest of the family knew something was off, even if they hadn't put the pieces together yet. They could sense it, the stolen glances, the way she and her cousin seemed to gravitate toward each other, no longer in the innocent, familiar way they once had, but in a manner charged with something new, something they couldn't hide. The worst part wasn't even the confrontation, it was the silence that followed. The way no one spoke of it afterward, like they were all afraid to poke at the truth for fear of what might spill out. It was as though the family had collectively decided to bury the incident beneath layers of polite conversation and superficial normalcy. But she could feel the cracks beneath the surface, widening with every passing day. Her mother's gaze lingered too long when they spoke. Her aunt, once warm and affectionate, now seemed distant, her smile strained, her questions curt. Even her father, who usually remained blissfully detached from the more emotional undercurrents of the household, had begun to look at her differently, his brows furrowed in a quiet, unspoken concern. No one had said anything outright, but the question still hung in the air, unasked but omnipresent. What have you done? She found herself retreating into herself, avoiding eye contact, keeping to the periphery of conversations. Every interaction felt like walking through a minefield, every moment filled with the dread that someone, anyone, might say something that would force the truth out into the open. And she wasn't ready for that. She wasn't ready for the explosion that would surely follow. But it wasn't just the pressure from her family that weighed on her. It was the internal storm raging inside her, a constant push and pull between what she felt and what she knew was expected of her. Her love for him, her cousin, was something that had grown so gradually, so quietly, that by the time she recognized it for what it was too late to stop it, too late to turn back. What once had been a comfortable, familial closeness had shifted into something far more complex, more dangerous. She thought back to that morning, to the moment her mother's eyes had searched hers for answers. What could she have said? How could she have explained the strange magnetic pull that had developed between her and him over these last few weeks? How could she make her mother understand that every time their hands brushed, every time their eyes met across a room, it felt like the world was tilting on its axis? How could she explain the way her heart seemed to beat faster whenever he was near, or the way her breath caught in her throat whenever he looked at her with that same intensity? But there were no words for any of it. There was no way to make it right, to make it understandable. And that knowledge, that painful, suffocating knowledge, crushed her more than anything else. They were bound by rules, by norms, by expectations that went back generations. Family was sacred. Family had rules. And this was crossing a line that could never be uncrossed. She had tried, oh, how she had tried to push her feelings down, to tell herself that this was wrong, that it was impossible. She had tried to avoid him, had thrown herself into the mundane routines of daily life, hoping that distraction would be enough to dull the edge of her longing. But every time she thought she had it under control, every time she thought she could compartmentalize her feelings and move forward, there he was smiling at her in that soft, familiar way, saying her name in that voice that sent shivers down her spine. And she would crumble. Every time. The emotional turmoil inside her had become unbearable, like a constant churning storm. One moment she would feel the weight of guilt and shame pressing down on her, nearly suffocating her under the burden of her family's expectations. And then, in the next breath, she would be consumed by longing, by the raw, aching need to be near him, to feel his touch, to hear his voice. In those quiet, stolen moments when they were alone, she felt a flicker of peace. It wasn't real peace, of course, more like a temporary reprieve from the chaos swirling around them. But in his presence, when it was just the two of them, everything felt simpler, easier. She didn't have to pretend, didn't have to fight against the feelings that had taken root in her heart. She could just be with him, and for those brief moments, nothing else mattered. But reality always came crashing back in, harsh and unforgiving. Every time they parted ways, she was pulled back into the suffocating web of her family's expectations, of the roles they were supposed to play. The guilt would gnaw at her, tearing at the edges of her conscience, until she could barely look her family in the eye. At night, she would lie awake, staring up at the ceiling, replaying the events of the day over and over in her mind. She would think about the way his hand had brushed against hers as they passed in the hallway, the way his eyes had lingered on her just a little too long during dinner. She would think about the way her heart had raced when he smiled at her, that soft, almost secret smile that seemed meant only for her. And she would wonder, was this love? Could it be love when it felt so wrong? She had no answers. All she had was the storm inside her, the conflicting emotions that refused to settle. Love, guilt, longing, fear. They swirled together in a relentless, chaotic dance, leaving her exhausted and broken. She knew that something had to give, that this tension couldn't last forever. But the thought of what might come next, of the fallout, of the pain it would cause her family, was almost too much to bear. And yet the thought of losing him was even worse. It was a no-win situation. No matter which path she chose, someone would get hurt. Either she would lose her family, the life she had always known, or she would lose him, the one person who made her feel truly alive. The weight of that decision crushed her, making it hard to breathe, to think, to function. Every day she felt herself being pulled further apart, like she was standing in the eye of a hurricane, waiting for the winds to tear her to pieces. In the silence of the house, in the midst of the unspoken tension that gripped her family, she could only wait for the storm to break, and hope that somehow she could survive the aftermath. The night had always held a kind of magic for her, a quiet, enveloping stillness that made the rest of the world feel distant and insignificant. But tonight that calm was elusive. As she stood by her bedroom window, staring out into the darkness, the cool night air drifting through the cracked pane, her mind was anything but peaceful. The stars blinked faintly overhead, barely visible against the inky sky, and the moon hung low, casting long shadows across the yard. She couldn't sleep. Of course she couldn't sleep. How could she? Her entire body hummed with restless energy, every thought consumed by him, her cousin, the boy who had once been as familiar as her own reflection, and now, the man who had become something far more dangerous. The image of his face, the way he had looked at her that morning, haunted her. There was an intensity in his eyes that had lingered long after he had turned away, a wordless confession that neither of them had dared to say aloud. But the silence was no longer enough. It hadn't been for some time. She had tried, desperately, to keep her distance, to maintain the illusion of normalcy in front of the family, but it was becoming impossible. Each day felt heavier, the weight of their unspoken connection dragging her down, pulling her back toward him no matter how hard she tried to resist. And tonight, after the tension of the day had reached its unbearable peak, she knew she couldn't stay away. Her heart pounded in her chest as she glanced at the clock on her bedside table, past midnight. The house had long since fallen into the familiar lull of sleep. She could hear the soft snores of her parents down the hall, the occasional creak of the old wooden floors as they settled under the coolness of the night. It was the perfect time. The only time. Silently, she grabbed her jacket, the thin fabric hardly enough to protect her from the chill of the night. But it didn't matter. She wasn't planning on being out long, just long enough to see him, to be with him, to feel something other than the crushing weight of guilt and confusion that had consumed her every waking moment. Her fingers shook as she pulled open her bedroom door, wincing as it creaked in protest, and slipped out into the hallway. Every step felt like a risk. The house, so familiar in the daylight, now felt like a labyrinth of potential traps. Any sound, any creak of the floorboards, could betray her. But she moved with practiced caution, her body tense, her breath held. She had snuck out before, of course, but never like this. Never with so much at stake. As she reached the back door, she paused, her hand hovering over the cold metal of the doorknob. For a moment, doubt crept in, the familiar tug of guilt tightening around her chest. What was she doing? This was madness. If anyone found out, if her family knew she was meeting him like this, in secret, in the middle of the night, everything would fall apart. Her stomach twisted at the thought. But it was too late for second thoughts now. She had already made her choice, and the pull toward him was too strong to ignore. The door clicked softly as she opened it, and the cool breeze rushed to meet her, carrying with it the scent of salt and seaweed from the nearby coast. She stepped outside, the soft crunch of gravel under her shoes the only sound in the stillness. The darkness swallowed her whole as she made her way down the familiar path toward the beach, her heart racing with every step. She didn't need a light, she knew this path by heart. She had walked it 1,000 times, but tonight, it felt different. It felt charged, electric, like the air before a storm. As she neared the beach, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore filled her ears, rhythmic and steady, a soothing backdrop to the chaos swirling inside her. And then she saw him. He was standing there, silhouetted against the silver glow of the moon, his back to her, as he stared out at the vast expanse of water. The sight of him, so familiar and yet so foreign, made her breath catch in her throat. For a moment, she hesitated, her feet rooted to the ground. But then, as if sensing her presence, he turned. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that instant, the rest of the world fell away. The tension that had been building for weeks, the unspoken words, the stolen glances, it all seemed to come crashing down around them in that one look. There was no escaping it now. She walked toward him slowly, her heart pounding in her chest so loudly she was sure he could hear it. The distance between them closed, and with every step the pull grew stronger, more undeniable. By the time she reached him, the space between them felt almost suffocating. They stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity, the sound of the waves filling the space where words should have been. She didn't know what to say, didn't even know if there were words for what she was feeling. But she didn't need to speak, he understood. He always had. His eyes searched hers, and she could see the same turmoil reflected back at her. The same confusion, the same longing, the same fear. It was like looking into a mirror, seeing all of her own feelings laid bare in front of her. She swallowed hard, her throat tight, her hands trembling at her sides. She wanted to reach out, to touch him, to feel something solid in the midst of all this uncertainty, but she couldn't bring herself to move. Finally, it was him who broke the silence. His voice was low, rough, like it was being dragged out of him against his will. "I couldn't stay away," he whispered. Neither could she. The truth of that realization settled over her like a heavy weight, and before she could stop herself, she took a step closer, her body instinctively moving toward him. She could feel the warmth radiating off of him, the familiar, comforting presence that had always been there, but was now tinged with something far more dangerous. "I don't know what we're doing," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper, the words catching in her throat. "I don't know how to stop this." His expression softened, and for a moment the tension seemed to lift, replaced by something quieter, something gentler. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her cheek in the lightest of touches, sending a shiver down her spine. "I don't think we can," he said, his voice filled with a quiet resignation. "We've tried." She nodded, her eyes closing at the feel of his touch, her breath hitching in her throat. He was right. They had tried to ignore it, tried to push it away, tried to pretend that the feelings between them were nothing more than a fleeting mistake, but it wasn't working. It had never worked. When she opened her eyes, his face was closer, his gaze locked on hers, intense and unwavering. There was no escaping it now, no pretending. They were standing on the edge of something they couldn't come back from, and they both knew it. Slowly, tentatively, his hand slid down from her cheek to cup her jaw, and she felt herself leaning into the touch, her body responding to him before her mind could catch up. Her heart pounded in her chest, the space between them thick with anticipation, with the weight of everything they weren't saying. And then, as if the decision had already been made for them, he leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in the softest, most tentative kiss. It was barely a kiss at all, more of a question, a plea for permission. But it was enough to send a jolt of electricity through her, to make her breath catch and her pulse race. For a moment she froze, unsure of what to do. The weight of what this meant, the finality of crossing that line pressed down on her. But then, all at once, it melted away. There was no going back, no undoing what was already done. And so, she kissed him back. It was soft, gentle, tentative, like they were both afraid of what might happen if they let themselves feel too much. But the longer they kissed, the more the tension between them seemed to dissolve, replaced by a warmth that spread through her entire body. Her hands found their way to his shoulders, clutching at the fabric of his shirt, as if he were the only thing keeping her grounded, and in that moment he was. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other as they stood there, the sound of the waves crashing behind them the only thing breaking the silence. "We shouldn't be doing this," she whispered, even though every part of her wanted to continue, to stay in this moment forever. "I know," he replied, his voice barely audible. "But I don't care anymore." And in that moment, neither did she. The morning after their secret meeting, the tension in the house had grown thick enough to suffocate her. It clung to every surface, every word that was left unsaid. As soon as she stepped into the kitchen for breakfast, she felt the weight of eyes on her. Her mother, her aunt, even her father, they all looked at her differently now. It wasn't outright suspicion, not yet. But there was a carefulness in their gazes, a subtle unease that had settled in, like a permanent guest at the table. They didn't ask her anything directly, but she knew they could feel the shift between her and her cousin. That once easy closeness had become something fraught, something no longer hidden behind casual smiles and laughter. It was as though they could all sense the quiet intensity that had begun to simmer between the two of them, even if no one dared to say it aloud. Her cousin sat at the far end of the table, his posture stiff, his eyes fixed firmly on his plate. He barely spoke, and when he did, his voice was a low murmur, devoid of the usual warmth and humor that had once defined his presence in the house. She glanced at him, hoping for some silent reassurance, but he didn't look back. They were both trapped in a delicate dance, trying desperately to maintain the illusion that nothing had changed, while knowing that everything had. It was her aunt who broke the fragile peace. She had always been sharp, quick to notice the smallest changes in the family dynamic, and today was no different. As she set down her cup of tea, she fixed her gaze on the two of them with a look that sent a chill down her spine. "You two have been awfully quiet lately," her aunt remarked, her tone light, but with an undercurrent of something more probing. "Usually we can't get a word in edgewise when the two of you are together." Her heart skipped a beat. The innocuous remark felt like a warning shot, a subtle probe to see how they would react. She forced a smile, hoping it didn't look as strained as it felt. "Just tired, I guess," she said, her voice too bright, too forced. Her aunt raised an eyebrow, her gaze lingering on her for a moment too long before shifting to her cousin. "And you? You're always full of stories when you come to visit. Haven't heard much from you this time." Her cousin glanced up, meeting his aunt's gaze with the same forced casualness. "Just busy, I guess," he mumbled, shrugging as if it were no big deal. But even to her, his voice sounded hollow, the weight of his unease palpable. The room fell into a tense silence after that, the quiet sound of silverware clinking against plates the only thing breaking the uncomfortable stillness. She could feel her mother watching her, though, and when she finally glanced up, their eyes met. Her mother's expression was unreadable, but there was something in her gaze that made her stomach twist, concern, maybe, or confusion, or worse, suspicion. The rest of the day dragged on painfully. She avoided her cousin as best she could, not out of a lack of desire to be near him, but out of fear that their proximity would only make things worse. She kept busy, helping her mother with chores, trying to lose herself in mundane tasks. But no matter how hard she tried to distract herself, her mind kept circling back to the same thought: they were being watched. Her family knew something wasn't right, and it was only a matter of time before their suspicions turned into something more dangerous. By the time dinner rolled around, the tension in the house had reached a boiling point. Her aunt's casual prodding at breakfast had given way to a more pointed curiosity, and it seemed that everyone could feel the unease that had settled over the house like a dark cloud. The conversation around the table was stilted, awkward, and she found herself dreading every question that was thrown her way, as though each one was a potential trap, waiting for her to stumble and reveal the truth. It didn't help that her cousin was barely speaking. He sat across from her, his eyes flicking up to meet hers only once or twice, and each time, the intensity of his gaze sent a shiver down her spine. She could tell he was struggling as much as she was struggling to keep up the facade, to pretend that everything was fine when it was anything but. Her aunt finally broke the strange silence midway through the meal, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You two seem different this time around," she said, her tone deceptively casual, as she set her fork down and fixed them both with an appraising look. "Closer, maybe." Her heart lurched in her chest, and she could feel her pulse quicken. The way her aunt said the word closer felt like a direct accusation, even if it wasn't one yet. She glanced at her cousin, her breath catching when she saw his jaw tense, his knuckles white as he gripped his fork. Her aunt continued, as though she hadn't just dropped a bomb at the table. You've always been close, but lately she trailed off, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied them both. It just seems different. Her mother shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze darting between them and her sister. Oh, they're just older now, she said, her voice a little too quick, a little too dismissive. That's all. They're adults, not kids anymore. The weak defense only seemed to fan the flames of her aunt's curiosity. Yes, of course. But she smiled, though there was no warmth in it. Adults sometimes have complicated relationships, don't they? It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. Every muscle in her body went rigid, and she could feel the heat creeping up the back of her neck. Her cousin was silent, staring down at his plate as if it held all the answers he needed. She, on the other hand, felt exposed, vulnerable, as though her aunt had peeled back all the layers she had tried so hard to build around herself. Her father, usually oblivious to the subtleties of family drama, glanced up from his meal, his brow furrowing as he sensed the shift in tone. "What are you getting at?" he asked, his voice gruff but tinged with confusion. Her aunt leaned back in her chair, her gaze still fixed on the two of them. "I'm just saying," she said slowly, "that I've noticed some changes between them. They're always off on their own, whispering, disappearing for hours at a time." She shrugged, though her eyes never left them. "It just makes you wonder, doesn't it?" There it was, the accusation, hanging in the air like a live wire, crackling with tension. The rest of the family fell silent, all eyes turning toward them. She felt the blood drain from her face, her heart pounding in her chest as she struggled to keep her composure. What could she say? What could either of them say that wouldn't confirm what everyone was already starting to suspect? Her cousin, finally, broke the silence. His voice was low, quiet, but there was an edge to it that made everyone pause. "We're just close," he said, though even she could hear the strain in his voice. "We've always been close." Her aunt raised an eyebrow, her smile thinning into something sharper, more dangerous. "Of course," she said softly, "but sometimes closeness can mean different things, can't it?" The table was deathly silent. Her mother was staring at her now, her face pale, her eyes wide with something that looked dangerously close to fear. Her father was frowning, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth, as if he had forgotten what he was doing. Her breath felt shallow, her palms clammy as she clenched her hands under the table. She wanted to scream, to deny it, to make some excuse that would dispel the growing suspicion in the room, but the words wouldn't come. And in that silence, in the way her cousin's shoulders tensed and his jaw tightened, she knew that there was no hiding anymore, not really. The rest of the dinner passed in a tense, uncomfortable quiet, but the damage had been done. The subtle tension that had been simmering under the surface had now been brought into the open, and there was no turning back. The family knew something was wrong, something was off. And while they hadn't said it directly, hadn't accused them of the unthinkable, she knew that it was only a matter of time before those unspoken suspicions turned into accusations. The evening dragged on painfully after dinner, with the family scattering to their respective corners of the house, each person clearly lost in their own thoughts. She could feel the weight of their glances following her wherever she went, as though they were waiting for her to slip up, to confirm what they were too afraid to say. When she finally found a moment alone, hiding away in her room, her hands shook as she sat on the edge of her bed, her mind spinning. What were they going to do now? How could they possibly continue like this, with the entire family on the brink of discovering the truth? A soft knock on her door broke through her panicked thoughts, and her heart leapt into her throat. She didn't need to ask who it was, she knew. Her cousin stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes filled with the same fear and uncertainty she felt. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. "They know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, unable to find her voice. The reality of the situation was crashing down on her, the weight of their choices pressing in from all sides. "They don't know everything," she managed to say, her voice trembling. "But they're close, too close." He sat down next to her, his hands trembling slightly as he ran them through his hair. "We can't keep this up," he said quietly, his voice filled with a quiet desperation. "They're going to figure it out." She knew he was right. The family's suspicions were growing by the day. and it wouldn't be long before someone confronted them directly. And when that happened, there would be no hiding, no more pretending. The truth would come out, and their lives would be forever changed. But even as the fear and guilt gnawed at her, there was still the undeniable pull toward him, that part of her that couldn't imagine walking away, even if it meant risking everything. "We'll figure it out," she whispered, though she didn't believe the words herself. "We have to." But deep down, she knew that the storm was coming, and when it hit, there would be no escaping the wreckage. It all came crashing down the next morning, like a wave that had been building and building until it could no longer hold itself back. She knew something was wrong the moment she walked into the kitchen. The house was too quiet, eerily so. Her aunt and mother were already seated at the table, their faces pale, tight-lipped, avoiding her gaze. Her father sat stiffly, his hands clenched around his coffee cup. There was no morning banter, no idle chatter about the day ahead, just an oppressive silence that made her stomach twist with dread. Her cousin wasn't there. The pit in her stomach deepened. Where was he? She glanced around the room, hoping to see him walk in, but the longer she stood there, the heavier the tension grew. Her heart began to race, her skin prickling with the cold realization that this was it. Something had changed overnight. Something was about to happen. Her mother's voice broke the silence, and when she spoke, it was low, cold, almost trembling. "Sit down," she said, her eyes fixed on the table in front of her, refusing to meet her daughter's gaze. It wasn't a request. It was a command, and the weight of it pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. She sat down slowly, her hands clammy as she placed them in her lap, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity before her aunt finally spoke. "We need to talk," her aunt began, her voice uncharacteristically harsh. "About what's been going on between you and him." Her chest tightened, a sickening knot forming in her stomach. This was it. The moment she had been dreading. The moment she knew would come eventually, no matter how hard she had tried to avoid it. Her mouth went dry, her pulse racing as she searched for something to say, some way to diffuse the situation. But no words came. Nothing she could say would make any of this better. "We've all noticed," her aunt continued, her tone sharp as a knife. "The way you two have been acting. You've been sneaking off together, avoiding the rest of the family. You've been different, both of you. We thought at first it was nothing, just you two being close. But it's not, is it?" Her voice caught in her throat as she tried to speak. "I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, though the lie sounded hollow even to her own ears. Her aunt's eyes narrowed, her face tight with anger. "Don't lie to us. We've seen it. The looks, the whispers, the way you can't even be in the same room without acting like something's happening between you. You think we're blind?" Her mother, who had been silent until now, finally looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and pain. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Is there something going on between you and him? Something more?" The shame hit her like a punch to the gut. She wanted to deny it, wanted to tell them they were wrong, that they were imagining things. But she couldn't. The truth was there, heavy and undeniable, choking the air out of the room. There was no way to escape it now. She glanced down at her hands, unable to meet their eyes. "It's not." Like that, she whispered, though the words felt weak, pathetic. "We didn't mean for it to happen." Her father, who had been silent this whole time, slammed his fist down on the table, making her jump. "Didn't mean for what to happen," he growled, his voice filled with anger and disbelief. "Your family. This isn't right. Do you even understand what you're saying?" Her heart pounded in her chest, her entire body trembling as the weight of their judgment crashed down on her. She could barely breathe, could barely think. All she wanted was to get out, to run, to hide from the shame and the guilt that was now suffocating her. "We didn't plan it," she said, her voice cracking. "It just happened. We tried to stop it. We know it's wrong, but we couldn't." Her mother let out a shaky breath, her eyes filling with tears. "How could you let this happen?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "How could you do this to us, to our family?" She wanted to say something, anything to make her mother understand. But the words were stuck in her throat. There was nothing she could say that would make this better. Nothing that could erase the hurt and disappointment etched into her mother's face. The room felt like it was closing in on her, the walls pressing in, making it harder and harder to breathe. Her father stood abruptly, his face red with anger. "You're going to end this," he said, his voice hard and final. "Right now." Whatever this is between you and him, it stops. Do you understand me? You're going to forget about this madness, and act like it never happened." Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she forced them down, nodding silently. She didn't trust herself to speak, didn't trust herself to say anything that wouldn't make things worse. "Where is he?" her father demanded, his eyes flashing with anger. Her aunt shook her head. "He's out walking," she said quietly. "We haven't spoken to him yet. We wanted to hear it from her first." Her father's jaw clenched. "Good. Because when he gets back, we're going to make it very clear that this, whatever this is over, permanently." The finality of his words hit her like a blow to the chest. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving her hollow, breathless. She wanted to scream, to protest, to tell them that they didn't understand, that they couldn't just end this as if it was something simple, something they could turn off with a snap of their fingers. But the fear, the shame, the guilt, they held her tongue. Her mother stood up, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed with tears. "I don't know what's going to happen next," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "But you've hurt this family in a way I never thought possible." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps heavy, leaving her daughter sitting there, alone in the suffocating silence. Her aunt followed, her expression unreadable, and soon it was just her and her father, the tension in the room so thick she could barely move. He stood there for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists, before finally shaking his head and walking out, leaving her alone with her shame. As the door closed behind him, she felt the tears finally spill over, hot and heavy on her cheeks. The fallout had begun, and there was no turning back. The day after the confrontation was unbearable. The silence in the house was so thick it felt like she was moving through fog, each step heavy with the weight of what had happened. The family wasn't speaking to her, not in the usual way at least. Her mother had retreated into herself, spending most of her time in her room, avoiding eye contact whenever they crossed paths. Her father hadn't said a word to her since that awful moment at breakfast. The tension was suffocating, pressing down on her from all sides, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. The worst part, though, was not knowing where her cousin was. After the blow-up, he had disappeared, slipping out of the house without a word. Her father had gone after him, and when he returned, the grim look on his face told her all she needed to know. Whatever had been said between them, it had not gone well. By the afternoon, she couldn't take it anymore. She needed to see him, needed to talk to him, to figure out what they were going to do next. She knew the family expected them to end it, to forget the feelings that had blossomed between them, as if they were nothing but a passing storm. But they couldn't. She couldn't. This was more than a mistake, more than a moment of weakness. What they had was real, and even if the world saw it as something wrong, she knew it was too powerful to simply ignore. As the sun began to set, casting a soft orange glow over the house, she slipped out the back door, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no plan, no clear idea of what she was going to say, but she knew she needed to find him. They needed to talk, to figure out how they were going to face this together. The beach was where she found him. He was sitting alone on the rocks, staring out at the waves as they crashed against the shore, his silhouette dark against the fading light. Her heart ached at the sight of him, hunched over, shoulders slumped with the weight of everything that had happened. For a moment she hesitated, unsure of what to say, unsure if he even wanted to see her after everything. But the pull was too strong, and before she could stop herself, she was walking toward him. He didn't look up as she approached, but she knew he could sense her presence. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of the decisions they had yet to make. When she finally reached him, she stood there for a moment, waiting for him to acknowledge her. But he remained silent, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I was worried about you," she said softly, her voice barely carrying over the sound of the waves. She wasn't sure what else to say. She wasn't sure if anything she said could ease the tension that had settled between them. He didn't respond right away, and for a brief, terrifying moment she wondered if he was angry with her, if he blamed her for everything that had happened. But then he sighed, running a hand through his hair in that familiar, frustrated way, and finally he spoke. "I knew this would happen," he said, his voice low, rough with emotion. "I knew they'd find out, and I knew it would come to this." She swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. "What did they say to you?" she asked, even though she already had a good idea. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "What do you think? They told me this has to stop. That I'm being reckless, irresponsible, That I'm ruining everything. He paused, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. My mom couldn't even look at me. My dad. He was furious. Said I've shamed the family. Said I should have known better. Her chest tightened at his words, a fresh wave of guilt washing over her. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I didn't want this to happen. He finally turned to look at her then, his eyes filled with a mix of pain and something else, something darker, more intense. Neither did I, he said, his voice softening. But it did, and now we have to deal with it. They fell into silence again, the weight of their situation pressing down on them both. She could feel the decision looming over them, a decision that would change everything. They could end it now, like their families wanted. They could walk away, pretend none of this had ever happened, and try to go back to being the people they were before. But the very thought of that made her chest ache, made her feel like she couldn't breathe. She couldn't lose him. Not now. Not after everything. We can't just let them decide for us, she said, her voice trembling. What we feel. It's not wrong. I know it's not. They don't understand. But that doesn't mean we should let them tear us apart. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and for a terrifying second, she thought he was going to tell her that it was over, that they couldn't keep fighting. But then he reached out, his hand brushing against hers, a small but powerful gesture. His touch sent a jolt of warmth through her, and she knew with every fiber of her being that he wasn't ready to give up either. I don't want to lose you, he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. But what are we supposed to do? They'll never accept this. They'll never accept us. Her heart ached at the vulnerability in his voice, but she held onto his hand, squeezing it tightly. Then we fight, she said, her voice gaining strength. We fight for us. We don't let them decide our future. We decide. The words felt like a weight being lifted from her chest, as if speaking them aloud had given her the strength she didn't know she had. They weren't just fighting for their relationship, they were fighting for the right to live their lives on their own terms, to love who they wanted to love, no matter what anyone else said. He looked at her, his eyes softening, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he smiled, a small, tired smile, but a smile nonetheless. You really think we can do this? He asked, a hint of hope creeping into his voice. She nodded, determination settling in her chest. I do, she said firmly. We don't have to stay here. We don't have to live under their rules. We can leave, start over somewhere new, somewhere they can't tell us what we can and can't do. The idea of leaving the coastal town, of leaving everything they had ever known, was terrifying. But the thought of losing him was worse. And she knew, deep down, that staying here would only mean more pain, more guilt, more suffocating expectations. They couldn't keep pretending. They couldn't keep living in a world that wouldn't accept them. He nodded slowly, his hand tightening around hers. Okay, he said, his voice steady now. We'll fight. We'll find a way. They sat there in silence for a while longer, their hands intertwined as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world into twilight. The future was uncertain, the path ahead filled with obstacles they couldn't yet see. But they had made their decision. They were going to fight for what they had, no matter the cost. And together, they knew they could face whatever came next. The plan had been decided in quiet, hurried whispers under the cover of darkness, far away from the prying eyes of their families. They knew it was the only way. There was no convincing their parents, no reasoning with them. The judgment had already been passed, and there was no turning back. If they stayed, they would be forced apart, forced into lives that didn't include each other, and that was something neither of them could bear. But knowing what had to be done didn't make it any easier. She stood in her room, the pale light of the moon casting long shadows on the walls. Everything felt surreal, like she was living in a dream or perhaps a nightmare. Her small suitcase lay open on the bed, half packed with clothes and a few personal items. It wasn't much, just enough to get by until they figured out what came next. The weight of what she was about to do pressed down on her, making it hard to breathe. Leaving this house, this town, meant leaving behind everything she had ever known. Her family, her memories, her entire life. It would all be left in the past, and she didn't know if she would ever return. The thought of it made her chest tighten, but she knew there was no other choice. The love she felt for him outweighed the fear, the uncertainty. They couldn't stay here and pretend to be something they weren't. Her heart ached as she thought about her mother. The way she had looked at her after the confrontation, eyes filled with disappointment and hurt, still haunted her. Her mother hadn't said much since that day, but the silence was even worse than the words might have been. It was a wall, thick and impenetrable, keeping them apart in a way that felt permanent. She didn't know if she could ever fix it, and that was perhaps the hardest part of all. Walking away meant leaving things broken. But staying meant living a lie. She pulled a sweater from the closet, tucking it into the suitcase carefully. Her hands shook as she worked, and she had to pause, pressing them against her chest in an attempt to steady her breathing. This was it. There was no going back after this. A soft knock at the door startled her, and she froze. For a moment, fear gripped her, wondering if her parents had somehow figured out her plan. But then the door opened just a crack, and her cousin slipped inside, his presence immediately easing some of the tension in her chest. "We're leaving in an hour," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. He looked at the half-packed suitcase on the bed and nodded. "You almost ready?" She nodded, swallowing hard. "Almost." He stepped closer, his eyes scanning her face with a softness that made her heart ache. "Are you okay?" She wasn't. How could she be? But she nodded anyway, forcing a weak smile. "I will be." They both knew this wasn't easy. Leaving wasn't just about them, it was about abandoning the lives they'd built with their families, the people who had raised them. It was about severing ties that ran deep, ties that had always been sacred. But the love they shared had shifted everything, turning their world upside down. Her cousin reached out, gently cupping her face in his hand. "We're doing the right thing," he said softly, as if he needed to convince himself as much as her. "We can't stay here and let them decide our lives for us." She nodded again, leaning into his touch, finding comfort in the warmth of his palm. "I know," she whispered, "but it doesn't make it any less painful." His thumb brushed across her cheek, and for a moment they stood there in silence, the weight of what they were about to do hanging heavy between them. They were about to walk away from everything they had ever known, from the people they had once been, and there was no going back. The finality of it settled in her chest like a stone, but she knew deep down that this was the only way forward. After a moment, he pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly, as though he could shield her from the pain of it all. She buried her face in his chest, breathing him in, her hands clutching at the fabric of his shirt, as if letting go would mean losing him forever. "We'll be okay," he whispered into her hair, his voice steady, even as she could feel his heart racing beneath her cheek. "We'll figure it out. Together." She nodded against him, though her throat felt tight with emotion. They had made their decision. Now all they had to do was follow through. After a long moment, they pulled apart, and she returned to packing her things, moving quickly now, as though the faster she moved, the easier it would be to leave. Her cousin stayed with her, silent but steady, helping her with the little things, folding a sweater, zipping up the suitcase. They didn't need to speak. The silence between them was full of understanding, of shared determination. When everything was packed, she took one last look around her room. It felt strange knowing this might be the last time she ever saw it. This room, with its familiar walls and creaky floors, had been her safe haven for so many years. Now, it felt like a prison, a place where she could no longer be herself. Her eyes lingered on the framed photos on her dresser, her family smiling, happy. A lump rose in her throat as she thought about what she was leaving behind. But there was no time for second-guessing now. They had to leave before anyone woke up, before anyone had the chance to stop them. She followed her cousin down the hallway, her steps slow and deliberate, as though each step was a silent goodbye to the life she was leaving behind. The house was still, the only sound the soft creak of the floorboards beneath their feet. When they reached the front door, she hesitated, her hand resting on the doorknob. "Are you ready?" her cousin asked, his voice quiet but filled with resolve. She wasn't sure if she would ever be ready. But she nodded. Yes. They stepped outside into the cool night air, the stars twinkling faintly above them, the world around them silent, as if it too was holding its breath. Her cousin's car was parked down the road, far enough that the sound of the engine wouldn't wake anyone. They walked in silence, side by side, the weight of their decision pressing down on them. When they reached the car, he loaded her suitcase into the trunk before turning to face her. "This is it," he said softly, his eyes searching hers. "Once we go, there's no turning back." She took a deep breath, feeling the finality of it settle in her bones. "I know," she said, her voice steady now. "But I'm not turning back." He smiled, that small, crooked smile that had always made her heart skip a beat. "Good." They stood there for a moment longer, the quiet night surrounding them, before he opened the car door for her. She slid inside, her heart pounding as he walked around to the driver's side. When the engine rumbled to life, the sound broke the stillness, and for a brief second, she felt the weight of her choice settle heavily on her chest. But then they pulled away, the house growing smaller in the rearview mirror, the past slipping away behind them. She didn't look back. She couldn't. This was their goodbye, not just to their families but to the lives they had once known. And as the road stretched out before them, dark and uncertain, she took his hand, squeezing it tightly. They were leaving everything behind, but they were doing it together. And that was enough.